Okay, so welcome. This is going to be part one of a 5 lecture series talking about aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and monetary policy. So, in this particular section, what we're going to be doing is actually deriving part of aggregate demand. I wanted to split this up into multiple videos. That way, you're not like super overwhelmed watching this like 3 hour lecture. I can split it up into little, 20, 30, maybe at the worst 40-minute lecture videos just to try to make things a little bit easier and more manageable for you all. So, we're going to be learning about how to graphically derive the aggregate demand curve. Now, a lot of macro models today are what's known as quote unquote micro founded, meaning that they're based on like micro foundations or micro economic principles. There are individual players with utility functions, there are firms with production functions, there are governments, there's central banks, right? There can be financial sectors, and they all optimize to formulate an equilibrium. And when they formulate this equilibrium, we can then sort of look at like shocks across the system, like different types of aggregate demand shocks. You can look at aggregate supply shocks, financial shocks, all these cool types of things. Now, we are actually not going to be looking at some micro-founded models, at least in this particular case. Depending on how things go, depending on how the course goes, I may cover a couple of micro-founded models just to kind of give you guys a little bit of an introduction to what real macroeconomics and monetary econ looks like. Because it's, I don't know, at least to me, it's kind of cool. But enough of that. Enough of that. So, what is aggregate demand? Well, aggregate demand is the sum of planned expenditures, or desired expenditures, if you want to call it such, by the 4 primary actors within an economy. We've got households, right? And households consume things, so they're going to get this little C subscript T. We got firms, right? They make things, they invest in capital in order to be able to produce things, so they get I. We got government, well, they tax and they borrow to be able to fund projects that, in theory, right, should be provided to produce efficiently in a system where whatever it is that's demanded is not exactly produced that efficiently within the typical market structures, therefore requires some kind of a third party to step in and distribute accordingly. So they're going to get G, right? So we've got C plus I plus G. Does it sound a little familiar? Sounds kind of like GDP, doesn't it? Well, it's basically, yeah. We get net exports. Now, net exports is going to be the difference between exports and imports. And when we sum all of these together, right, we get these 4 primary actors, we sum their planned expenditures together, we're going to be getting aggregate demand. So we get this Y superscript AD equals C plus I plus G plus NX. All right, so this equation 1 here is our aggregate demand, right? But if you look at this, right, it's Y is a function of all these variables, and it would be nice to be able to get it in terms of, like, I don't know, price. So we've got output and price, but we don't have price here, right? We've got all these other endogenous variables like consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically try to find some cool ways to be able to express this guy in terms of output and price. So that way, right, when we look at like a typical demand graph, which is, price and quantity, we're going to be getting the exact same thing. We want to be able to understand that relationship to see what the relationship between price and output is at the aggregate level. So we can see that this guy looks like GDP, and that's because based on the definition of GDP, this side explains planned expenditures. So if you think of GDP as income, right, the income's got to be split up and spent on different things, right? Think of it like as your house, right? Within the household, you're going to split your income up on these different things. Go out just a little bit, right? Like even think just like the local level, right? Within the local level, right, the GDP within that particular small like geography, right? It's going to be split up on consumption, investment, there's going to be some kind of local government spending stuff, right? Well, the more you expand outward, right, the more you aggregate it up, the more this kind of actually holds. Right? So if it holds at the individual level, it's going to also hold at the aggregate. So what we're doing in this series of lectures is first we're going to be discussing the individual components of aggregate demand. Then we're going to be deriving the graph of actual and desired expenditures. We're going to be using that graph to derive the IS curve, which is the curve that mostly summarizes fiscal policy. Mostly. And we're going to be deriving the LM curve, or a curve that really summarizes monetary policy, in the next video. In the next couple of videos after that, we're going to be using the intersection of these two curves to get aggregate demand. And we're going to derive a long-run aggregate supply curve. We're going to derive a short-run aggregate supply curve. And then we're going to look at the equilibrium, probably talk about some shocks throughout the equilibrium, see how the whole system kind of responds to different types of shocks. Cool stuff like that. So that's what we're going to be doing in this series. Now, we're going to start with the consumption function. Why? Well, because it's the first thing to show up in the aggregate demand equation that we saw. So consumption is governed by what's known as a consumption function, which is this equation 3. C equals C bar plus MPC times Y minus T. And I'm going to go through each and every one of these components. Right? Y is income. T, taxes. So Y minus T is just disposable income, right? If you earn $100,000 a year and you've got to pay, say, I don't know, $33,000 of that in taxes, right? 100,000 minus 33,000 leaves you what? $67,000 of disposable income. So this is taking your output and it's controlling for the amount the government is taxing out of your income. The C bar is autonomous consumption, and that depends on stuff that's independent of disposable income, right? So this can be stuff like future income, right? Like if you're going to be making more money next year, right? You know, you're getting a raise, you know, you're getting a promotion, something like that. Well, that could be something like it. Interest rates, right? Interest rates would be autonomous stuff because, well, it's independent of disposable income. There's uncertainty, right? There's sort of this, well, I don't really know what's going to happen in the future. I don't really know how things are going to go. Maybe, you know, everything's going to be fine. Maybe not. Maybe there's going to be, I don't know, a boogaloo of some sorts. There's going to be like a Civil War 2.0. There's going to be a complete collapse of the system. Maybe another deadly infectious disease is going to come out, right? And any of these things happen, you're probably going to want to save. Well, then again, actually, if a lot of those things happen, saving's not really going to help you very much. But, okay, let's say there's uncertainty about somewhat less dire outcomes. You're going to want to save in order to have like a nice little rainy day fund, right? Maybe you're worried you might lose your job. Well, okay, cool. That's going to factor into the uncertainty. So your consumption is going to change based on some of these things, right? And there's also government spending, especially right now with the way things are going. Our government's really trying to spend a lot of money that they don't necessarily really have yet. And so there can be a lot of uncertainty around that. If the government's going to be spending a lot of money, we all know, well, that means they're going to be taxing a lot of money. And if they're going to be taxing a lot of money, you want to actually be able to make sure you can pay those taxes. Otherwise, you know, the IRS is sending you angry letters saying, we want the money that you owe us, and we're going to garnish your wages. And yeah, doesn't sound like very fun stuff to me. I don't know if it sounds like fun to you guys. So you're going to want to have some money set aside in case the government decides to tax you more, right? So your autonomous consumption may depend on government spending because eventually that will impact taxes. Finally, this MPC, this is what's known as the marginal propensity to consume, and it's bound between 0 and 1. That's all you really need to know right now. There will be like a problem set where you get to play around with the marginal propensity to consume, see kind of what the relationship is with it. But for now, it's just bound between 0 and 1. Now, investment refers to expenses by businesses on new physical capital. This can include stuff like residential construction, inventory accumulation, machinery that's used in production, things like that. Now, the investment function is given by equation 4. I equals little bar over I minus D times R, where R is the real interest rate, D is a parameter that governs how sensitive investment is to the real interest rate, and this I bar is autonomous investment, so it's investment that is independent of the real interest rate. It can be expectations about the future, efficiency of producing new capital, government regulations and taxes, right? Any of these things will be changing investment. So now we got the government. Good old government. They're like that kid that sits in the corner and eats glue constantly. Well, the government taxes and borrows in order to be able to fund projects like roads, infrastructure, 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 infrastructure. Come on, man, it's infrastructure, right? Everything is infrastructure these days. Yeah, hooray, more infrastructure. And we assume that government spending and taxes in this model are going to be exogenous. What does that mean? Well, it means this, right? So G is going to be equal to G bar, T is equal to T bar. Government spending and taxes are determined from outside the model. That's what exogenous means. So if they're exogenously determined, right, there won't be something within the model that changes that will then be making the government go, we want to spend more money, or we want to tax more, we want to tax less, things like that, right? Rather, these are going to be things that are determined completely outside of the environment. All right, think of this as like a little ant colony, and we decide how much we want to, like how much food we want to put in the ant colony. Well, if you're a heartless bastard and you don't really care too much about the ants, you're just going to put as much food in there as you want, or as little food in there as you want. Nothing they do is going to change your mind. Now, I don't know, me personally, I'd just be feeding them, like, exactly what they need, but, it's because I'm not, heartless bastard. But anyways, I digress. Taxes here are what's known as lump sum. So what does lump sum mean? Well, it means that essentially there's no marginal tax rate, right? So if there's no marginal tax rate, there's no flat tax even, right? This is like even more regressive than those, because with a marginal tax rate, right, like kind of a progressive tax rate, the more you make, the higher you're going to pay out in your share of your earnings, right? So if you're making $500,000 a year, you're going to be paying a much higher marginal tax rate than if you're making like $50,000 a year. Flat tax, on the other hand, is something like if you're making $500,000 a year, you pay 20% of that. If you're making $50,000 a year, you're paying 20% of that. Lump sum is if you're making $500,000 a year, you pay $400. If you're making $50,000 a year, you pay $400. Everybody pays the same lump sum transfer, right? It's just some flat amount that is completely independent of your income. Doesn't matter what you make, you pay a lump sum tax. So anywhere that you see a G or T in this system of equations that we're covering, just put a bar over it. I don't know why I said but a bar. It's supposed to be put a bar, but sometimes there are typos in LaTeX, and LaTeX doesn't catch it. Oops. So we're going to be assuming that the budget is balanced. So the government isn't going to be borrowing anything, right? Now, that kind of removes a lot of dynamics out of this stuff, which is going to be good for us for now, right? We don't really want to jump headstrong into these dynamic stuff. Let's deal with a static system for a little while first, right? Because if you're borrowing, that means you got to pay it back tomorrow. So you can kind of think of it as like you're borrowing from your future self. Gets a little complicated right now, just static stuff. So we've got a balanced budget. The government spends what it needs based on the taxes that come in, and it spends exactly what it taxes, and it taxes exactly what it spends. So taxes are going to be sufficient to cover their planned expenditures. And like I said, we'll get to borrowing and debt stuff later. So we've covered consumption, we've covered investment, and we've covered government. Now we got to talk about net exports. Net exports depend on the exchange rate and other non-modeled stuff. A high U.S. interest rate will lead to an appreciation of the dollar against other foreign currencies. Foreign investors want to buy U.S. assets, and it pushes the dollar up relative to other currencies. An appreciation of the dollar leads to other imports, which are cheaper for the U.S. to buy foreign goods, right? And fewer exports, meaning it's more expensive to buy U.S. goods, thus net exports are going to fall, right? So if the dollar gets more expensive, basically, if the dollar is at a higher exchange rate relative to other currencies, okay, it's cheaper for us to buy foreign goods, right? Because these other currencies are now worth a lot less than what they were before, because our currency has gotten more powerful, right? So it takes fewer dollars to buy the same amount of, euros or British pounds, right? So it's cheaper for us to buy foreign goods, but it's more expensive for them to buy our goods, right? So imports will increase, exports will fall. So therefore, net exports will fall. Now, the net export function, where this little bar and X is autonomous net exports, right? So it's going to be stuff that's, again, independent of real interest rate. We've got X, which is a parameter that deals with the sensitivity to the real interest rate, and then, of course, just the real interest rate. So we got this stuff right here. Okay, so total and planned or desired expenditures as such are just going to be this right here. So what I did was I just took the previous equations for consumption, investment, and net exports, and I threw them all together. Now, you're probably going like, Jeremy, why didn't you put government in there? Well, I didn't put government in there because, well, the government spending is exogenous, and it's going to be picked up within the consumption function because we've got disposable income there. So for the sake of simplicity, and in case some of you recognize any of this stuff, I was very, very heavily inspired, we'll say, by a set of notes from an instructor at the University of Notre Dame, Eric Sims. Great researcher, teaches excellent stuff, and at least for this stuff of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, his set of notes were actually just totally phenomenal. So I borrowed rather heavily from them, just because I don't want to get hit with any kind of copyright. Well, that's not really copyright, but I guess more plagiarism than copyright. But yeah, just getting that out there. Anyways, for the sake of simplicity, I'm just gonna let a bar equal all this autonomous stuff, right? So A is like all the exogenous variables. So now what we've got is y equals AD plus the marginal propensity to consume times y minus the sum of D and X times the real interest rate. So I've got one equation with three unknowns, right? I've got y, AD, y, and the real interest rate. dx and the marginal propensity to consume, MPC, are parameters, and a bar is exogenous. So in equilibrium, total output has to be equal to total planned expenditures. So this implies that y equals y AD. Right? So in that case, kind of put some things together, jumble some stuff around. Don't worry how I did it. You don't have to do it. But we get this, which is expressed in equation 11. Y equals 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume times a bar minus d minus x over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume times r. Now this you're going to know, or you're going to need to know. Equation 11 is important. Getting there, it's good to see in the lecture, but you need to be able to use equation 11. So how do we derive all this junk graphically? Well, first, what we do is we draw a graph with desired expenditures, this y superscript AD on the vertical axis. Then we have actual expenditures y on the horizontal axis. Right, so we just get this right here. Now remember, in equilibrium, y and YAD have to be equal to each other. So if you were to draw out every single point on this graph where y and YAD are equal to each other, what do you get? Well, you will get a diagonal line, a 45-degree line. Now, as I said, in equilibrium, these two guys are equal, which helps us find the relationship between desired and actual expenditures and income. Now, like I said, to begin relating them, we draw a 45-degree line, indicating the continuum of all points in which YAD equals Y. So we get this right here, right? If you've got a graph of Y and X, right, and you want to know all the points where Y and X are equal to each other, it's just the graph Y equals X, and it gives you exactly this, a 45-degree line that passes directly through the origin. So now what we need to do is we need to plot, right, our planned or desired expenditures. Now, this is going to be a line that's upward sloping in income, meaning if income goes up, desired expenditures will also go up. Thus, we graph it as the following, where this Y and YD, or YAD, intersect, right? And we're going to label this function of desired expenditures as Y, it says YT0 superscript D, it's just YAD. YAD0, right? So this is what we get right here. YAD0 equals the C plus I plus G. And when that crosses that 45-degree line, right, that gives us an equilibrium point. Now, if I want to shift this guy up a little bit, right, this YAD, if I want to shift that guy up just a little bit, what we get is a new line with a new set of planned expenditures and a new equilibrium point. And if I were to drop it down a little bit, right, if I want to shift it downward instead of upward, well, this is what I get. I get a new set of equilibrium points. So here I've got 3 equilibrium points. where planned or desired expenditures equal actual income. Now, from this, I can derive what is known as an IS curve. So what is that? Well, from this condition, right, it was originally equation 11, now it's equation 12, because, well, I put it in a second time, and it just adds 1 to 11, which is 12. From this condition, right, I have one equation and two endogenous variables. I've got the real interest rate, and I have income, right? Everything else is exogenous or a parameter or something cool like that. So with these two endogenous variables, r and y, right, I can plot out what the relationship is between r and y based on this stuff right here. Now, if you think about this just for a second, right, you're probably going like, God, this is a lot, right? It's kind of weird stuff to be looking at. Well, okay, this y, right, this is the dependent variable. This r is the independent variable. Now, this stuff here, right, it's exogenous to y and r. So if you were to put it in a graph with y and r defined as the axes, right, this is constant. This is a constant, thus it is an intercept. Now this minus d minus x over 1 minus MPC. Okay, well, this stuff, these are exogenous variables or parameters. Don't depend on y or r, right? So this is, again, happening outside the system. So again, right, this stuff you can think of as the slope. It's going to be the change in y, d minus x, over the change in r, 1 minus MPC. Right, so this is slope-intercept form. Y equals m, this junk here, times x, which is r, plus b, which is this 1 over 1 minus MPC times a bar. So this is really just slope-intercept form. And with this one equation with two endogenous variables, we can now plot a relationship between y and the real interest rate. Now, I know that's not exactly what we wanted, because we want a plot of y price p, and p is not r, right? We got the price or we have the real interest rate. They are not the same thing. But this is an important step to be able to plot out the relationship between price and output. So we get what is known as the IS curve. Now, this IS curve is the set of real interest rate and output combinations where equation 12 holds, right? Where the equality that's presented in equation 12 exists, where y is equal to all that stuff. This is essentially a curve that summarizes the income and real interest rate combinations where goods markets are in equilibrium. And it's called the IS curve because it's a set of all of these interest rates and output, right, GDP, at which total investment equals total savings. So there's a bunch of different ways to think about this, but the way that we're really going to be approaching it from sort of a policy understanding, or like a policy perspective, is going to be such that really it's a curve that is downward sloping that is going to essentially summarize fiscal policy interventions and sources of demand shocks that are like, shocks to consumption, investment, or, government spending, which is fiscal policy. And we can derive this stuff graphically in that, like I said, it's downward sloping, right? So if you've got R on the vertical, Y on the horizontal, right, the relationship between the two is negative. It's going to be an inverse relationship. And it's going to shift to the right whenever this A bar increases. So we're going to draw a graph underneath the one that we made, right, with that little 45-degree angle and the planned or desired expenditures crossing, right? We're going to draw a graph directly under that with the real interest rate on the vertical axis and Y on the horizontal. Now, I'm dropping the functional notation of this YAD equals C plus I plus G because I kind of want the stuff to fit on the graph and so the graphs would line up and stuff like that, right? So this is what we get. Now, the top graph is exactly what you saw before, except, functional notation changed a little bit, but the graph itself is exactly the same. Now, the stuff underneath, all right, this is what's going to plot out the IS curve because I've got the real interest rate on the vertical axis and I've got output on the horizontal. Now, I meant to remove these little T subscripts here. Just pretend that those T subscripts aren't there, right? So it's just Y on the horizontal up top, Y on the horizontal down below, right? So because those horizontal axes are the same, the two graphs are stacked on top of each other, if you change y in the top graph, you're going to change y by the exact same amount in the bottom graph. So we can, whatever happens in the top will transmit to y in the bottom, which works out rather nicely for us, right? So this is what the IS curve looks like. You can see it's downward sloping in the interest rate and output combinations, right? So if, say, the interest rate were to increase, output would fall. And we're going to get to why, mildly intuitively, that works in just 1 second. So now we draw some dotted lines down from the 3 intersection points in the top graph to the bottom graph, right? So we got these 3 intersection points, right? This y1, y0, y2. We're just going to draw those dotted lines down, and we're going to do it in a way that has a negative relationship between the real interest rate and output. So with the real interest rate on the bottom graph as the vertical axis, we ask ourselves how this stuff might respond to a change in the interest rate, right? Are you going to have lower or higher interest rates when incomes are high? So let's think about this for a minute, right? Actually, you know what? Screw it. Let's think of it this way instead. What happens when interest rates go up? Now, I've probably said before, when you raise rates, a recession is likely to follow. If you're going to have an increase in the real interest rate, a recession follows. So, if a recession follows as a result of an increase in interest rates, incomes will fall. Why do incomes fall? Well, if we go into a recession, right, you're probably going to lose your job. Well, maybe you won't, but more people will lose their jobs, right? Unemployment goes up in a recession. So when unemployment goes up, the aggregate people are bringing less money in, right? There's less production, less stuff is being made. Now, when less stuff gets made, there's less income. With less income, well, yeah, not good. Now, if that happens as a result of an increase in interest rates, well, we can now see there is an inverse relationship between interest rates and income. So for every equilibrium in which desired expenditure equals income, we draw this little dotted line downward to the bottom graph, keeping in mind that where income is higher, the real interest rate will be lower. Boom, we get this, right? You're going to want to remember this very, very, very well. Now, the bottom graph, right, this with R and Y in this downward sloping IS curve, right, that downward sloping IS curve is given by the equation here, equation 12, right? That is the downward sloping IS curve. Right, so we've got this downward sloping IS curve. That's going to be something you really need to know. That's going to be very, very important for you to know. So that will wrap up the stuff about how we derive the IS curve. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to be deriving the monetary policy curve, right? It's also called the LM curve for the liquidity of money. Once we get that, we're going to have the intersection between the two. And the nice thing is, right, the monetary policy curve is a function of, well, output and interest rate combinations that stem from changes in monetary policy, which affect, excuse me, what is it? Oh, yeah, the price level. So if we can combine the IS and LM curves, right, and we essentially just kind of substitute out that real interest rate, we are now going to have a function that is y equals something, something, something with the price level in it. So if we combine a curve that has output and the real interest rate and a curve that has output, real interest rate, and the price level together, we can get something that is a function of output and the price level, which gives us aggregate demand. So yeah, okay, cool. A lot of fun stuff there. But just focus on what you've learned today. And there will be another lecture coming out in about 2 days talking about how we derive the LM curve. Now, once we've derived the LM curve, then we're going to get into some of the aggregate supply stuff. And there's going to be at least 2 lectures on the aggregate supply stuff, one on the long-run aggregate supply, which is a much easier one to learn, and then a short-run aggregate supply, which is a little bit less easy, but it's still relatively easy. And from there, we will go on to equilibrium, and we will be discussing shocks to the system in an aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework. But that's it for today, so enjoy the rest of your day, and be on the lookout for another lecture in a couple days. Thank you for watching.